Hello, I'm Sebastian Michael, and this is this Saturday's Sonnet. Not mine own fears, nor the prophetic soul of the wide world dreaming on things to come, can yet the lease of my true love control, supposed as forfeit to a confined doom. The mortal moon hath her eclipse endured, and the sad augurs mocked their own presage. Incertainties now crown themselves assured, and peace proclaims olives of endless age. Now, with the drops of this most balmy time, my love looks fresh, and death to me subscribes, since, spite of him, I live in this poor rhyme, while he insults or dull and speechless tribes. And thou in this shalt find thy monument, when tyrants' crests and tombs of brass are spent. And this is the astonishingly interesting and potentially really quite revealing sonnet 107. Now, those of you who are following these sonnets even just vaguely, or have watched one or two of these episodes, will have noticed that I do them in batches of 7. I record and post one a day, which means 7 a week, and then at the end of the week I choose one from that week's batch to talk about. There's no reason for this other than that it lends itself to do this way. There is no thematic imperative that demands that the sonnets be looked at in batches of 7. It's just a practical thing that gives me sort of a timetable and the rhythm, if you like. Now, we made one exception very early on, I believe, and I would feel tempted again to do that this week, because this week we have had 2 sonnets that really need talking about in a little bit of detail. But in next week's batch, the next batch of 7, there's another one which we also absolutely have to talk about. And so we're going to change the rule a bit this time round. I'm going to do one episode on this sonnet 107 because it is so extraordinarily interesting, and then we will take a break with the posting of the sonnets. This won't affect any of you who watch these out of sequence anyway, or in months, days or years to come, and then we will do another episode on one more from this week's batch, and then we'll continue as we've done before. This is for those of you who are interested in the procedural matters of Saturday's sonnet. Why is sonnet 107 so extraordinarily interesting? Well, here we have a sonnet that talks about events. I need to qualify this. Here we have a sonnet that could be read as talking about events that happen in the outside world. Our rule of engagement with these sonnets, if you like, and that sounds a bit confrontational. The terms of friendship then we have established with these sonnets have been that we have been going by the words. And we've been listening to what the words tell us, and we've inferred a few things from these words. We've been trying to understand the words and maybe draw some conclusions about the kind of relationship I, the poet, am having with, in this instance, still the young man. But we have not really paid too much attention to outside events, and certainly we have not drawn into the discussion outside sources. And this is another rule I'm going to break this week, because after all, what's the point of having rules if you don't occasionally find an opportunity to break them? And this week we are certainly going to do that. Only a bit, because I still don't really want to get into an academic discussion where I then have to follow the rules of an academic discourse and give you sources and reference this person and that person, compare this person's argument with another person's argument, and then draw my own conclusions. That's not really how I want to go about it. I want to read the songs, listen to them, and find out what they tell us, and give you a few ideas of what that might be. This week we will bring into this look at the sonnet a few outside pointers or events, simply because they are so unbelievably interesting. Now, why would this be interesting? Well, the reason this would be interesting is that if it were to be true that I, the poet, have in this sonnet, either deliberately or subconsciously, mentioned events that happen in the outside world, And if we then could identify what exactly these outside events are, we would know when the sonnets were written. Again, I need to qualify this. We would know when this sonnet was written, but you may remember that last week we identified the time frame for the Fair Youth sonnets up to this point, up to point 104, to be more or less exactly 3 years. I mean, when I say more or less exactly, that's kind of 3 years in a Shakespearean context, where we don't really mind so much about days and maybe even weeks, but certainly months. In terms of months, roughly, they would fall into a time frame of 3 years. And if you'd like to know why, then just go back to last week's episode and you will find out. So if we then could establish when 107 was written, then we would not only have a time frame, we would actually be able to place this relationship. And that may, of course, also tell us who the young man could be. We have a fairly narrow field of candidates. Very early on, you may remember, we said that there's a shallow pool of potential candidates. And this may narrow down that particular pool. It may even hone in on one or maybe two people. I mean, the pool isn't much bigger than 2 or 3 people anyway, but you can see what I'm getting at here. And that's why there is great excitement abroad about 107, because it may serve as a sonnet that can time the entire sequence. Again, I need to qualify this statement as well, because the fact alone that we may or may not be able to time Sonnet 107 does not give us an absolute guarantee that the other sonnets precede this one by precisely 3 years and a bit. There may be unexpected gaps, for example, between 104 and 107, but let's have a look at how we got from where we left off to here. And it's not a big journey, because we left off really at 105. We mentioned 105 in last week's episode, and so there's only one that sits in between last week's episode and this week's episode. And what's that then? Let's have a quick look. 106 is another very beautiful elaboration on the man's beauty. And the thought here is simply that if I were to look at what people in the past have written about beauty, all I see really are descriptions of you, of your beauty. And that means that all these people ever talked about in their praise of these exquisite, perfect features, all they ever really did was make prophecies of you. And we today have the privilege of actually being able to see you, and they, at the time, because they were only making prophecies and only describing something that would come to pass, namely you, did not have sufficient skill or potentially style, there's discussion about this particular word, to accurately describe you, to do you justice. And we today, even though we can look at you, we lack the tongues. We are speechless in view of your beauty, and so we can't describe you either. So 106 does not really offer any new insights or even any new themes. It's very much something that we have seen and heard before, but expressed very beautifully, of course, and very poetically. That's what's happened since last week. This week we are at number 107, and to get anywhere at all with this, we need to look straight away at the question, what does it mean? Sonnet 107. Not mine own fears, nor the prophetic soul of the wide world dreaming on things to come. This is important already, that we have a state of fears, of anxiety that I express about myself, that I have had. Neither those, nor the prophetic soul of the wide world dreaming on things to come, nor the world's own prophecies, nor the way they imagine things might turn out. And in the context of my fear, this phrase of a prophetic soul, that suggests, certainly in terms of the tone, that neither I nor the world at large were expecting very good things to happen. There was a fear, there was an anxiety about what the future might hold. But neither my own anxiety nor that of the wide world can yet the lease of my true love can yet control or determine the duration. Lease is normally used in Shakespeare. He uses this to describe the duration, the term, or possibly also the nature of my relationship. In other words, the kind of contract I have or the type of relationship I have with my true love. And this is interesting already because that I would have fears or anxieties about the lease of my true love, that makes perfect sense. After all, he's my true love. But that the wide world should have a prophetic soul about the lease of my true love, that tells us a lot about the fact that this true love and this relationship is in the eye of the world. And we have talked about this at some length in the past, but this is interesting. And then comes a description of this lease as it was imagined, or as maybe the cause of my anxiety and the prophecies that are being made about it, supposed as forfeit to a confined doom. Now, a confined doom would be certainly a doom, certainly something that is doomed to end, to fail, to end in disaster. Confined would be locked up or contained or imprisoned, either literally or metaphorically. And supposed as forfeit of that, the lease of my true love was foretold to be the forfeit to a confined doom. In other words, there were fears, mine own fears, and there was a prediction by the wide world with its prophetic soul about where this relationship is going to go, namely that it would be destined to doom. And not only any doom, but a confined doom. And this, of course, now immediately begs the question, well, what do I mean by that? What could I possibly mean by the confined doom? And we will get to that. But these are the options. They are either talking about a relationship that is destined for some catastrophic failure, or some restriction, or some hindrance or obstacle, or some bad end due to some limitations, or it could also quite literally mean that my love, my true love, the person whom I love, is destined to a confinement that is his doom. In other words, that he's able to get away or out of again. These are sort of the possibilities. And then a new thought: the mortal moon hath her eclipse endured, and the sad augurs mock their own presage. Uncertainties now crown themselves assured, and peace proclaims olives of endless age. The words themselves, again, they are potentially heavy with all manner of meaning, but what words themselves, what do they mean? Well, the mortal moon hath her eclipse endured. Well, literally that would mean there's been an eclipse of the moon that has happened and that's been endured. Big discussion already about whether this endured means survived, or whether it means gone through and not necessarily done so alive. Because also, of course, what or who is this mortal moon? The moon in the sky would not really be considered to be mortal. The moon in the sky would really, certainly in Shakespeare's day, be considered to be immortal, endless, infinite. So interesting that we are talking about an event, an eclipse, that has been endured, either been passed through or survived. Endured in the sense of this was a difficult time, but now I'm through it. And this is either somehow to do with the real moon, or it is a metaphor for something or somebody else. And the sad augurs, now tied into this same event with this and because of this, the sad augurs mock their own presage. Now, the sad augurs are the prophets of doom, and don't we know who they are? There are always people who will be pessimistic and who will foretell the worst thing is going to happen. This happens today, of course, in politics, it happens in culture, it happens in everything. There will always be people, particularly people with a voice, particularly journalists and particularly commentators, who say, oh, it's all going to end in disaster, oh, this is going to be terrible, oh, this can never turn out well. So clearly in Shakespeare's day there have been sad augurs, there have been augurs, people who make prophecies, who've been sad, pessimistic, and they mock. They are now talking about their own predictions mockingly. In other words, they now think, oh, was I silly to make this pessimistic forecast, to think that things would turn out so badly. I now have to eat my words almost. I mock the things I thought I knew would happen. Uncertainties now crown themselves assured. Things that were uncertain now crown themselves. They now stand up at being certainties, and not just in a kind of trivial way, but they crown themselves. Really interesting use of the word crown themselves now. And this could be another big hint that's being dropped here into this Sonnet 107. And peace proclaims olives of endless age. The peace that we have now, this certainty that we have now following these uncertainties, this crowned certainty we have, proclaims olives, in other words, the olive branch of peace, of endless age, forever. We would hope forever. History will prove otherwise, of course, but that it always does. But certainly at the moment, after time of turbulence, after time of uncertainty, after time when we were being told things are going to end in disaster, not just about anything or anyone, but about mine own true love, and when I was fearful, now we have certainty and we have the prospect of peace for a long time to come. Now, with the drops of this most balmy time, my love looks fresh, and death to me subscribes, since, spite of him, I live in this poor rhyme, while he insults all dull and speechless tribes. Now, with the drops that come from the balm that this peaceful time is that we have now, so when I am in a peaceful time after a period of stress, it feels like a balm. I can relax, there is a restoration of equilibrium. And with these drops, that act like a balm of this peaceful time, my love looks fresh. So the anxieties that have distorted him, or that have distorted the love itself, and that have made me fearful, and that may well have taken that toll on him physically, or certainly taken that toll on the relationship, they are over. The love is fresh. And death, to me, subscribes. Death seems to be associated with this impending doom, but now with this balmy time, death is at my service, not I at his, since spite of him, because in spite of him, I live in this poor rhyme. We've had this before, we've had this as far back as number 18, but here, interestingly, it's not just you, the person I'm writing to, who will live forever through my poetry. It is me. I'll live in this poor rhyme, while death is going around insulting all dull and speechless tribes. All dull and speechless tribes are people who do not have written language yet, and they remain speechless, of course, in inverted commas, because they cannot pass on to future generations their poetry and their wisdom, and that's why they are at the moment still all dull and they remain speechless. Unlike me, I can make myself live forever in this verse, even though it may be a poor rhyme, but it is still sufficient because it's written down to make me live forever. And not only that, but also you will in this find your monument. This is something I've said before as well. When tyrants' crests and tombs of brass are spent, because of course tyrants' crests, they are finite, they will fall apart, they will be lost, they will become meaningless, and tombs of brass, they also will disappear over time. What won't disappear over time is my poetry. And now in this poem, in this sonnet, I'm not just saying you will live in my poetry forever, I'm saying we both will live in my poetry forever. It's a defiant sonnet. It's a defiant sonnet because it says, there were these prophecies of doom. I had my own anxieties. The world prophesied that things were going to turn out badly for you or for our love or for both. And look what's happened. We have a period of peace, we have a balm, you are restored to freshness, and death, well, death now is my servant, because even though he may ultimately catch up with me, he's not doing so now, and I have means to live forever. And not only that, I have means to make you a monument, and because I put both of us into this same verse, the world will know we are in this together. This relationship of ours, this love of ours that has been foretold to end in catastrophe and disaster and doom, it will live forever. And now, at this point, of course, we come to the additional layers of meaning, because we've sort of just translated this sonnet and we still don't really know what do I mean by all this. I speak in heavy symbolic language. I invoke the mortal moon. I talk about these prophecies. I talk about this balmy time making you fresh. Well, what are these events? Well, what's actually happened? What brings about all this? And here is where we may have to look outside the sonnet, or even if you don't have to, it's kind of interesting to do so, because what could bring all of this on? There are several, I'm sure you'll be glad to know, several possibilities. Of course, it's not as simple and straightforward as there being one fine, definitive answer that would make everything just so easy and so simple and so, quite frankly, boring. No, of course not. There are about 5 possible meanings that could be inferred from this. Only maybe 3 of them we probably have to take seriously. The first one that sometimes is considered to be a possibility is events that happen in 1588, and that would be the conquest of the Spanish Armada. And a lot of editors agree that this is highly unlikely, partly because it really doesn't fit with anything else, and also it's ridiculously early. In 1588, I am 24 years old, so I have no real reason to think of myself as old, and also none of the candidates for the young man really fit into this time frame. So I feel quite confident in letting that one more or less go. Then there's a more literal reading of the eclipse of the moon reference that would lead us to 1595. We are living in a time, of course, then in Shakespeare's day, which is quite superstitious. On one hand, it's very, very religious. Of course, it's religiously conflicted as well. And eclipses of the moon are considered to be potentially pretentious and not necessarily to augur well. And there is an eclipse of the moon that happens in 1595. So it's possible that I quite literally talk about lunar eclipse, that there were some prophecies of doom to do with the lunar eclipse, and that now that we've gone through this, everything is okay. This is also possible, and I'm certainly not entirely dismissing this, except it's not very interesting. It sort of fits already much better with the overall time frame that we would consider sensible, because by now I'm 31, and although this is still not for us very old, I've gone over the threshold of 30, and that's a big psychological threshold that anyone who's ever been over the threshold of 30 knows. Then it becomes already a whole lot more interesting, because the Queen Elizabeth, is at the time referred to as a Diana. She is likened to the goddess Diana, who is the goddess of the moon. And she, Queen Elizabeth, who has this goddess-like lunar face, which is completely white, caked in white makeup to make her look untouched and untouchable. She has what's called the grand climacteric, which is her 66th birthday. The 66th birthday in numerology at the time is considered to be a dangerous phase of somebody's life. It's almost an eclipse of the moon, and it could bring disaster in a big way. And if we were to take the word mortal in the phrase, the mortal moon hath her eclipse endured, if we are to latch on to the word mortal, then this could quite conceivably be a reference to Queen Elizabeth I, who is in a way a moon-like figure, you could argue, going through her 66th birthday, that there are prophecies of doom and fear about this imminent event, and that she has endured it, as in survived it, and that none of the prophecies have come about, and now we have a new period of peace and stability because all this uncertainty is over, and now we can take a deep breath and we can say, in this peaceful, more relaxed time now, my love is fresh again. Also, if we were to accept this as our pointer, then it would date this sonnet in 1595/96, which is an excellent time for us. It's also possible that it refers to Queen Elizabeth, but not to her grand climacteric, but to a serious illness. Say, for example, if she's the old queen is very, very ill, she has no successor, she hasn't appointed a successor yet. There's great anxiety in the whole of England about the question of succession. This is well established, and if she, of course, is seriously ill and we have to fear that she may die, then that would mean upheaval, it would mean restlessness, it would possibly mean falling apart of the Reformation, which she stands up for, and because there may be a Catholic successor, there may be religious warfare, there may be civil war, there may be great worry about the Queen being unwell. So similarly to her having her grand climacteric, her symbolically and astrologically and numerically extremely important birthday coming up, there would also be similarly great anxiety about her being unwell, and that is documented to be an illness, a severe illness of the Queen at the very end of the century, 1599/1600. This similarly is absolutely a possibility, and it also lacks a little bit a satisfactory connection to the young lover. Why would he be fresh now that this anxiety is over, and why would the world have any anxieties about him? But there are many possible reasons that we simply don't know about. So we just have to accept that this may be something we don't have an answer for. And there is also, and this I think makes it the fifth possibility, another metaphorical eclipse of a metaphorical moon, which would be the death of Queen Elizabeth I. Certainly at her age, we would have been anxious about her death, anxious about her succession, anxious about the possible strife and war and conflict that her dying without appointing a successor or having given birth to an heir to the throne might cause in the country. There would have been predictions of doom, definitely, and her having her eclipse endured may simply mean that she has died, as we all must eventually. Endure doesn't have to mean survived. You could endure, quite conceivably, your own death. And this would work as well, and it would put the sonnet in 1603. This creates, for me personally, me as Sebastian Michael, a little bit of a complication, because I quite fancy the sonnets being a little bit earlier than that. Many other things to me point towards the 1595-96 date. That's a very attractive date for me. That really fits in extremely well with how I view other things happening in the relationship and who I think the young man is. This makes things a little bit more complicated, but it interestingly points at the same young man who I think we've been looking at all this time. And who is this? Am I really here now at this point going to put my hand down and lay it on the table and say I think it is the young Earl of Southampton? Well, I think maybe this is the time. I have really shied away from this, not because I have not been thinking about the young man as the Earl of Southampton, but simply because this is a big discussion that can and needs to be had. Who is the young man? And there is another episode for certain to be dedicated purely to this question. But I think it's probably fair that at this point in the proceedings, I can at least tell you, without giving you all the reasons yet, I lean quite strongly to the young Earl of Southampton, Henry Wriothesley. And this, although it's not for me the best possible explanation of this sonnet, 1603 is really not when I would like this sonnet to be timed for all manner of reasons, but it does tie in really rather well with the second part of the sonnet and the third part of the sonnet. And that helps in a way. It helps to know that they also can be addressed and, if you like, explained, or at least looked at as not being random expressions of something or other, but to actually make sense. The sad augurs mock their own presage. Uncertainties now crown themselves assured. Well, if this is about the death of Queen Elizabeth I, the uncertainty of who will succeed her is now crowned, literally, assured in King James I of England, the Sixth of Scotland. He's come down to take on the English crown as well as the Scottish crown, and suddenly we have stability, we have certainty, and we have the word crown in there, which may just simply not be a coincidence. It may be a coincidence, but it may well not be a coincidence. And peace proclaims olives of endless age. That also fits. King James I of England was a peaceful king. He declared peace, and there was a period of stability that was very clear quite quickly that he was not going to cause either an internal civil war or go about fighting external wars very quickly. So this would fit, and most interestingly, in a way most fascinatingly and most also infuriatingly apt is this line: "Now with the drops of this most balmy time my love looks fresh, and death to me subscribes. Since spite of him I'll live in this poor rhyme." Well, we don't know whether anything of what I've just said about any of the possible timings is true or relevant or applicable. It may, for all we know, still be just a sonnet that's just written randomly. But if all these various instances, in almost every single line there is one, were to match up with actual events, this line would as well. Because the young Earl of Southampton in 1601 was party to a failed coup against the Queen and languished in prison since 1601, so for about 2 years, and to all intents and purposes as a traitor who, or as party to a traitor who wanted to overthrow the Queen. He really ought to have died. The only reason he didn't is because he had such extraordinarily strong connections to the royal household. There's lots and lots and lots to be said about that, but it is extraordinary in itself that the young Earl of Southampton, now aged 28 in 1601, is imprisoned, and there would be people, most certainly, who would predict at that time that that's it, that he's had it, that he will be executed or languish in prison in confined doom forever. King James accedes to the throne and very quickly releases the young Earl, not so young anymore, Earl of Southampton, and that would mean that at that time he is fresh. And death, which has hung over him like a Damocles sword, now subscribes to me, the poet, because I am back to where I was before. I can write beautiful poetry and make me and you live forever. This is really, really quite interesting and quite exciting. It would mean that if we were to accept that this is the case, and I'm really not so strongly suggesting that we do, because I really think at the moment, why not leave things open? But if that were to be the case, that would mean that this sonnet must have been written approximately 1603, and that would mean that either there was a long gap between 104 and 107. This is also possible. We can't rule it out. Or if there wasn't a long gap between 104 and 107, that would put the beginning of the relationship between me, the poet, and in this case, almost certainly the Earl of Southampton, in about 1599, 1600, which would make me, the poet, age 35, 36, and the young man aged 25, 26, thereabouts. And that is maybe the main argument, if there is one, that speaks against this particular interpretation. It puts their relationship, if it's these two people, it puts it quite late. It puts it at a time when the young man is really not all that young. He's really a proper adult then, 26, 25, 26, is proper grown up in Shakespearean times. And many other things that would make him, this particular young man, the Earl of Southampton, a wonderfully appropriate candidate for everything we've been saying so far. All of these things that do apply so well apply to him really a few years earlier. So there's a conundrum, there's a dilemma for us when we now look at these sonnets, because we have been looking at the words and we have found many things that have told us who this might be, what the nature of the relationship is, how long it's been going on for. And here we have one sonnet that may either tell us quite specifically when it was written, or we are making a mistake and we're reading far too much into it and it's really about something completely different. Or there is an unusually long gap between the bulk of the sonnets and this particular one. And so this raises many, many additional questions, which I'm sorry in a way to say we can't answer satisfactorily within this episode of Saturday's Sonnet. But we have now changed the tone of conversation a bit, because we have now named one of the potential candidates, and that means we will have to name the others as well, so we'll get to that. We've also looked at the possible timing for this particular sonnet, and we feel pretty certain that there is a time span of 3 years during which this relationship lasts, and so we want to look a bit more at some of the events that have happened during that time and why one candidate may be more likely than another. And that means we are no longer just simply listening to the words. We have now looked outside the sonnets, and of course once you look outside then you have to go for a little stroll, don't you, and see what the weather is like. And that's what we are going to be doing, which is why there'll be another episode at some point about all of this. And as I've already said, there will be another episode about one of the sonnets in this week, because we have barely scratched the surface of this week's sonnets. But I think this is quite enough to be getting on with, because I don't want to make one single episode too long. And after all, it's a movable feast, it's a flexible thing. We can do as many episodes as we like. And I have a feeling that probably we'll get to the question, who is the young man and when is this all really happening? Not actually now, but when we've dealt with the fair youth sonnets. That means after 126. So, many, many more interesting, fascinating, riveting sonnets, and also extremely beautiful sonnets to look forward to. Remember, love is the power, and see you next week.